Thank you, Dr. Manika. First of all, let me say it's an honor and a privilege to be here in front of you and to represent the private sector. And thank you to the ambassadors of Guyana and Norway for hosting us. The topic I'd like to talk about today is how can big data help address some of the barriers to getting capital for SDG. Let me just list four. They are not exhaustive, but could be a sample area that I could sort of discuss some ideas for public and private partnership. The first is confidence in fiscal and monetary management. This often is a key consideration as investors look to invest in an economy. They could be local or global investors. Number two, as regulatory requirements of banks increase, their ability to make loans is rapidly reducing. And as a result of which, for SDG, we need to find new sources of capital. And there are other sources of capital, like institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, asset management firms, private equity firms, but they have different needs. And data can help create transparency to meet their needs. Number three, local debt markets is absolutely critical for physical infrastructure investments. And data can again play a pivotal role in enabling those, and I'll talk about that. And last but not the least, transparency into governance and regulatory processes. This is a key consideration that many institutional investors have to follow before they can invest in any project or corporation, and data can help with that. Let's take the first one, building confidence in fiscal and monetary management. Now, the private sector for many years has been collecting large databases of macroeconomic data. So at least in my firm, and we are not the only one, we have macroeconomic indicators of over 200 to 300 different data points over pretty much most of the countries on this planet for the last 50 years, okay? And that has always been available. But now with the investments in open data standards, what we are doing is combining that macroeconomic data with other new innovative data sources, which gives us better insight into the economy. For instance, in some countries, we will measure credit card purchasing patterns or auto sales as a leading indicator of consumer sentiment, right? With open data, I can access that very quickly. In other cases, I might actually be measuring unused real estate capacity as a predictor of non-performing loans and credit quality in that country, right? So we use this data, and we don't just capture it. We are investing in analytical models that allow you to then predict various aspects of the economy and scenarios of fiscal and monetary nature using that data. One example is just this year, we recently introduced a sovereign credit default prediction model. What that model does is uses all the traditional quantitative economic indicators, which you're all familiar with, but it also marries them with several other considerations like geopolitical risk and other factors, which makes this probability a lot more accurate.
How do we get the private sector and the public sector to work together for the common public good? Because it almost seems as if these are happening in two different spheres.
If you were to take a look at the second barrier, which is really we can't depend on banks anymore, we've got to find new institutional investors. Now, what these institutional investors need is transparency into the risks and the returns of their investments. Now, the kinds of investments that we need for sustainable development are usually long-term and illiquid. And there aren't enough investment benchmarks to guide these investors to decide if I should invest in it and does it meet my investment needs. Now, this is another area where the private and the public sector can come together. We are actually developing a standard for green bonds. Now, green bonds are environmentally sensitive bonds. We can create pricing and benchmarking services for green bonds, which allows investors to invest in it. If you go to one of our websites, you'll see that there is something called a Thomson Reuters Global Index. It's available for free. But what we do is we go through all the data sources that are available, not just quantitative, but also news, research, and we build a trust index, which is published every day on the confidence level that the market has in the top 50 financial institutions of the world. Now, you can take the same technology and build country-level confidence indices. And that would be a great benchmark for investors to use, right? We can create investment benchmarks for illiquid long-term investments. There's a lot we can do to help the public and the private sector come together. A third barrier that I'd like to talk about is debt markets. We all know that credit ratings is the key bottleneck for SME financing and long-term investments. Now, in the private sector, there has been several years of investment in building innovative credit risk and probability development models, where we not only use as reported financial data, which, as you all know, is not always a reliable source for credit rating in many places. We marry that with a lot of unstructured data, such as legal filings, management history, commentary on the local economy, to come up with much more accurate predictions of the probability of a credit default, right? And we can combine these initiatives together to make things happen. Last but not the least, transparency into regulatory and governance and compliance. For many years, the private sector has been developing large databases which create transparency around environmental, social, and governance maturity. These databases, we could partner with the public sector to expand them to all the countries and the areas where it is relevant and make it available. This would create transparency. I'll end with one last idea where we are working with an African country to make this happen. As the regulations around anti-money laundering laws have become more and more stricter, the compliance demand on knowing your customer before you transact with them has increased. Now, this compliance demand has become even more demanding when you're talking about cross-border trade. And that creates a whole layer of verification and counter-verifications with multiple players in the mix. What we're doing in this one country in Africa is we've set up a KYC, or Know Your Customer utility, a data utility which is available to all participants. It is a once-and-done place where you can create an ID for one organization and then use that to store all relevant identification and risk information about that ID, that corporation, which banks as well as corporations can use to create a certified transaction. What that has done is several corporations in this country have now become bankable because they meet the KYC norms, right? So there are several areas that I think the public and the private partnerships can exist. There'll be many others. I think I've taken more than my share of the slot, but thank you.